ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to begin now. I'm simply here to have our attendees numbers coming in. We can hopefully see these coming in and increasing as we go along. So you're very welcome to this, the latest in responsible business webinars. We've had several of these so far, and we've had very good attendance and very good feedback on these. So my name is Owen Richardson. I am the director here in the Trade Compliance and Responsible Business Unit within Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. And as my role of leading on the coordination of responsible business, it's to bring together the various initiatives and measures that are taking place in the responsible business arena under the banner of responsible business that are, I suppose, most salient for you, our stakeholders, businesses, NGOs, and representative groups. So you're very welcome. We've got a very interesting hour or so ahead of us, and I hope you all enjoy it and find it very informative. We have three topics today. We have four speakers. Our first is Aisling Byrne, who's going to speak on the CS Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Apologies for the acronyms. We've got Alan Power and John Morris, who are going to be talking on the regulation for a product ban on items made of forced labour. And then finally, we have Paul McMahon, who's going to speak on the OECD guidelines for multinationals and the national contact point. So these are three very different initiatives, and they're very important at the moment due to their progress, particularly the first two at EU level and the various agreements that have happened. And I will allow the experts to speak on them. So it's a very interesting time for these initiatives. It's a very, I suppose, time to consider where we're going for it. But I'd just like to point out first that the reason that we're doing this as policymakers is that there is a mandate from the people, both in Ireland and at EU level, that we action this and that we task business with taking this forward. So it's very opportune for us to discuss what is happening in these initiatives. And then finally, I suppose we have been tasked through our various initiatives, including the Responsible Business Forum, by the stakeholders and by our ministers to communicate to you the latest developments, to try and make this clear and to be responsive to your questions. So we'll have the three files that we've spoken about today, and we'll follow that with a question and answers session. We may not be able to get through all of them, but we will leave up as our final slide a number of contact emails that if you have specifics, you can email to it. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Minister Calleary, the Minister for Trade Promotion, Digital and Company Regulation, to give a short introduction to this webinar. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be with you live online, but I want to record this message and share my thoughts on this very important agenda. I really appreciate you all taking time out today to hear about the ongoing initiatives in this space. And I hope you'll find this latest webinar in our series of responsible business useful. Responsible business is important. It is continuing to expand as we see a growing consensus amongst consumers, amongst the business community, and amongst lawmakers regarding the need for comprehensive measures to promote responsible business practices. The progression of legislation at EU level, such as the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the Forced Labour Regulation, which you are hearing about today, exemplifies this commitment to driving systematic change across various sectors. It reflects not only the desires and expectations of business stakeholders for more ethical and sustainable products and services, but also signals a recognition that responsible practices are not just a moral obligation, but that they're also a strategic imperative for your long-term success. As the various responsible business initiatives progress, businesses need to not only be aware of the requirements, they need to act and act now to make sure that you are prepared when these initiatives come into force. I would strongly encourage you to go back to your business, to go back to your organizations, to share the information obtained today, and to consider what actions you could put in place now to help your business or your organization to spread the message that we need to adapt when the time comes. My officials and I are acutely aware that this will not be an easy task. We have several initiatives in the mix at the moment. They all have different requirements, and in a lot of cases, details of what exactly will be required of businesses are yet to be finalised at EU level. We are striving to provide clear, concise information to business as soon as it is available via the webinars such as we have today, via established networks such as Responsible Business Forum, the Enterprise Forum, the Retail Forum, and via our social media network and the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment's Enterprise newsletter. I encourage all of you to remain engaged with the department to ensure that you are subscribed to the Enterprise newsletter and the emailing lists that are being highlighted by presenters. For those of you who attended the last webinar, you will be aware that my department was successful in sourcing EU funding to create a responsible business compass, which aims to make the language terminology within these directives more accessible to you. This is still at an early stage, but we are working to ensure that the compass will be launched by the time the first of these new mandatory initiatives are in place. My department remains committed to helping Irish business navigate these initiatives. I continue to chair the Responsible Business Forum, which last met earlier this month, and a forum which will be crucial to share information and gain insight from business representative bodies and feedback from their client base. It is important to highlight that the benefits that come with adopting responsible business initiatives, both mandatory and voluntary, are immense. Responsible business practices are not at odds with profitability. They are the bedrock of sustainable and resilient enterprises. By aligning with these evolving regulatory frameworks, businesses can only not meet legal requirements, but you can also gain a competitive edge by demonstrating your commitment to responsible business practices, which will not only enhance your reputation, but will foster stronger relationships with your employees, with your customers, and your investors. This is an area where sustainability is not a buzzword, it is a necessity. And in that area, the role of businesses in driving positive change cannot be overstated. As we navigate this complex and this evolving landscape, I encourage you to embrace the understanding that business holds immense power to shape a future where economic prosperity is synonymous with responsible business practices. I know that businesses are keen to meet this challenge. Our department is ready to help. Gurmeen Mahagov.
Well, I think you can see it's clear that Minister Calleary is both passionate and has a deep involvement in this area. And it's great to have an ally such as Minister Calleary steering this ship. So I'd like to hand over to my colleague Paul McMahon first, who's going to speak on the OECD guidelines for multinationals. And really this is key because this is where a lot of the language and the kind of history of this comes from. So I think it's a very good opportunity to understand this and where it's going. So over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Owen, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to give you an overview of the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct and the role of the national contact point therein. So I am sure many of you are wondering, if you haven't heard about these guidelines, what exactly they are and what is the role of the NCP. So the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct, we simply refer to them as the guidelines, provide a comprehensive framework for responsible business conduct. So they do this they reflect the expectations from governments to enterprises on how to act responsibly, covering all major areas of business ethics, with the aim to promote positive contributions by enterprises to economic, environmental, and social progress. How do they do this? They provide principles and standards in responsible business conduct, or RBC, that are consistent with applicable laws and internationally recognized standards. So, for example, the Human Rights Chapter is aligned with UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, while the chapter on employment and industrial relations is aligned with the ILO labour standards. The guidelines themselves were incepted back in 1976, and to date they have been revised 6 times, with their last revision taking place last year, which I will talk about shortly. They have built on the 2011 revisions, which include the concept of risk-based due diligence for RBC, or responsible business conduct. It is important to point out that the guidelines themselves are voluntary recommendations, and therefore they're non-binding on enterprises. But at the 51 adhering countries, including Ireland, we are bound to implement them. Seem to be having a problem with moving my slides. Yeah, okay. So the guidelines themselves, they're divided into 2 parts, and the first part relates to these recommendations for responsible business conduct. In total, there are 11 chapters in this first part with 9 thematic areas, and which you'll see there in the box on the right. The first 2 chapters at the start of the guidelines, they relate to the concepts and principles and general policies, while the second part of the guidelines are known as the procedural guidance, which set out the implementation procedures for the adhering countries. So in a way, it's an instruction manual for the national contact points. The chapters most referencing complaints to date are general policies, human rights, employment, industrial relations, and the environment. The general policies chapter includes important provisions around implementing due diligence with respect to an enterprise's own activities and business relationships, and engaging with relevant stakeholders in a meaningful way. On the human rights chapter, enterprises can have an impact on virtually the entire spectrum on internationally recognized human rights. This chapter establishes that enterprises should conduct due diligence to avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts in their own activities, but also those linked to their supply chains and business relationships. The chapter on employment and industrial relations promotes observing international standards developed by the ILO by asking enterprises to respect core labour rights and support the establishment of responsible business or responsible labour and industrial relations policies. As I mentioned just briefly, a brief time ago, the last update took place last year. It had been a decade since they were previously updated, and given the changes that have taken place around the world, they needed a refresh to take account of how business operate globally in today's world. So these targeted updates have taken account of changes such as climate change, the digital world, and the need for resilient and inclusive supply chains. As you might suspect, this means chapters on the environment and science, technology, and innovation have been significantly updated to reflect developments over the last 10 years. The environment chapter clarifies expectations for responsible business conduct related to climate change and biodiversity crises, aligning with internationally agreed goals on climate change and biodiversity, for example. There are now due diligence recommendations to harness the digital transformation, including the development, financing, sale, licensing, trade, and use of technology. The human rights chapter now includes strengthened provisions regarding human rights defenders and Indigenous peoples, while the chapter on disclosure reflects the growing demand for RBC by both stakeholders and shareholders, and is aligned with the G20 OECD principles on corporate governance. The implementation procedures that I mentioned that act as a guide for the NCPs have also been updated to advance achieving functional equivalence amongst the 51 NCPs located across the globe, while taking into account the need for flexibility. So on to the next slide. The essence of the guidelines is to avoid adverse impacts directly by an enterprise or indirectly through a business relationship, for example. So to avoid, prevent, and mitigate adverse impacts, enterprises should carry out what's known as due diligence. And this means that they should introduce a process to identify, prevent, reduce, and account for how they address actual and potential adverse impacts. To assist them with this, in 2018, the OECD published its due diligence guidance, the first document on the left-hand side there. And this guidance for RBC provides practical support to enterprises and helps promote a common understanding amongst governments and stakeholders on due diligence for RBC. The guidance sets out a 6-step due diligence process, which is to 1, embed responsible business conduct into policies and management systems. 2, to identify and assess adverse impacts in operations, supply chains, and business relationships. 3, to cease, prevent, or mitigate adverse impacts. 4, to track implementation and results. 5, to communicate how impacts are addressed, and 6, to provide or cooperate in remediation when appropriate. In addition to this guidance for 5 particular sectors was issued to support enterprises operating in these areas. They include the extractive, agriculture, minerals, garment and footwear, and financial sectors. And the guidance clarifies how businesses can operationalize risk-based due diligence into management systems and global supply chains. So moving on to the role of the National Contact Point, or the NCP. We love acronyms in the public service, as you know. We are a standalone unit in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, and under the guidelines, governments are requested to set up an NCP. So the NCP has 2 main functions, and that is 1, to promote and advocate the guidelines and related due diligence guidance, so awareness of them is raised. And the second role is to handle complaints of alleged non-observance by a multinational enterprise referred to as a specific instance. On the promotional aspect, there are a number of avenues we continue to pursue to raise awareness of the guidelines and the Ireland National Contact Point. Information sessions and webinars such as the one today are very important to us. Over the last 3 years, we've hosted a number of information sessions, participated at trade union events, and been responsible for organising these responsible business webinars. We also continue to use our social media to raise awareness using the department's LinkedIn and Twitter accounts, or X accounts. Then on to the big role for us as well is handling complaints or specific instances are known under the guidelines. So this is a unique built-in grievance mechanism where the NCP can contribute to the resolution of issues that arise in relation to the implementation of the guidelines. So we may offer what's known as our good offices to help the parties involved come together to resolve the issues by providing a platform for discussion through mediation or conciliation. Complaints received under the NCP process are not legal cases, and we are not judicial bodies. Our focus is on problem solving using non-adversarial dialogue, typically through mediation, to help the parties find mutually agreed solutions or resolutions. Typically, there are 4 stages involved in the specific instance or complaint process, and the first stage is the initial assessment. So the NCP will receive a complaint from a notifier. Typically, so far, that has been an NGO or trade union, but any party can submit a complaint if they have an interest in it. When we then inform the enterprise that the NCP has received a complaint, send in the details received and request a meeting to explain the NCP process and what the guidelines mean. The enterprise is then given a chance to respond, and this response is shared with the complainant. Based on the information that we've received from both parties, the NCP will then make a decision as to whether the issues raised merit a more detailed examination. It is important to clarify that if the NCP does accept a complaint and move to the offer of good offices, this does not mean it is determined that the enterprise has or has not breached the guidelines. Regardless of whether an NCP accepts or does not accept a complaint, a statement will be published on our website. So in instances where complaints merit further consideration, we move then to the good offices stage. And this stage is offered to the parties to assist with the resolution of the issues raised in the complaint. It involves consultations with the parties through consensual and non-adversarial dialogue. So both parties concerned need to agree to this offer, and the parties commit to participate in good faith is a crucial element in this process. As I said, it typically involves mediation to provide a pathway forward. Terms of reference are agreed between the parties as it provides a framework, and they will work then with an externally appointed mediator and the NCP to provide a framework for the mediation. So if the parties reach an agreement on the issues raised in the complaint, the process can be closed, and the NCP will prepare a final report in coordination with the parties. If it's a case that the parties cannot agree on a resolution during the mediation, the NCP will also issue a statement, and we can make recommendations also. We will also issue a statement and make recommendations in a case where a party may be unwilling to participate in mediation itself. We're moving on then to the 4th stage, which is the follow-up. So this is a case if the parties reach an agreement or the NCP has some sort of recommendations, the NCP will follow up the parties to determine if these recommendations or agreements have been followed in accordance with the statements. The NCP may then issue a statement on this. So on to our final slide here, and this is the Ireland NCP peer review, which took place in October 2021. The purpose of the peer review was to assess how we were functioning and operating at that time. It identified what we were doing well and what we could improve upon using recommendations. So following our peer review, we received 8 recommendations relating to our structure, our institutional arrangements, how we promote the NCP and guidelines, and how we handle complaints. We have made progress on several of these areas and are continuing efforts to do so. We are in the process of creating an advisory group to assist us with our dual mandate, that is to promote the guidelines and handle specific instances. So the group will consist of individuals from other government departments, a business representative body, trade union representative body, and civil society representative. So we are also in the process of updating our rules of procedure, which set out how we handle complaints in line with the implementation procedures of the guidelines. We expect to seek feedback from stakeholders once we've prepared these, so keep an eye out on our website if you're interested. If you want to know more about the Ireland NCP peer review, the report is available on our website, and you can find more information about the complaints that we have dealt with so far and the guidelines on enterprise.gov.ie/OECD NCP. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I am now going to pass you over to my colleague, Aisling Byrne, who will talk about the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Thank you.
Paul, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aisling Byrne and I work in the Company Registration and Regulation Policy Unit of the department, and I'm looking after the CSCD proposal. So we might begin with the current status of the proposal. So essentially, following trilogue negotiations, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence proposal has been approved by both member states and the European Parliament. The text of the proposal is being finalised, and once that's finished, it will be officially published in the official journal of the EU. So what is the CSCD? Well, firstly, it's known more generally as the CSCD rather than the longer title. It's going to create legally binding obligations on companies within scope of the measure, and that's to address the adverse environmental and human rights impacts arising from their own operations, their subsidiaries' operations, and their chain of activities. It's the first mandatory initiative of this nature to be applied across a trading bloc like the EU, and in essence, it builds upon and draws inspiration from a number of the voluntary responsible business measures, such as the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines that Paul has just outlined to you. So, as you can see from the slide there, it joins a variety essentially of other measures that the EU is putting in place to bring a greater focus to ESG matters more generally. And in terms then of the actual scope of the measures, so there was a kind of more last minute change to the scope of the companies covered in the proposal. So it is going to apply to both EU and non-EU companies, and you'll see there for EU companies, it's companies with 1,000 plus employees and net worldwide turnover of 450 million. And for non-EU companies, there isn't an employee threshold. It's just based on the turnover itself. So it's in the main, it's generally the larger companies that are included within the scope. And just to point out there that SMEs aren't directly within scope, but they may be indirectly affected if they're involved in the chain of activities of the larger companies. So what does this mean for companies? So firstly, companies will need to incorporate due diligence into their overall strategy and risk management systems. They're going to need to carry out risk-based human rights and environmental due diligence. And that due diligence is, the purpose of it is to identify actual or potential adverse impacts and prevent, mitigate, or minimize the extent of such impacts within their own operations, their subsidiaries, and their chain of activities. So companies will be able to do that by virtue of mapping out essentially their own operations and their subsidiaries and their business partners. The risk-based approach, it was introduced during the course of the negotiations. It's favoured by both industry and civil society alike, as it's in line with the voluntary responsible business conduct measures. Where companies form part of a group, the ultimate parent company of that group will be able to carry out the due diligence requirements on behalf of the subsidiaries. And the effectiveness of the due diligence measures needs to be assessed after a significant change occurs, but at least every 24 months. Companies are also going to need to put in place a complaints procedure, and that complaints procedure will address complaints from individuals affected by or who have reasonable grounds to believe they may be affected by an adverse impact arising from the company's operations, those of their subsidiaries or their chain of activities. And it includes, it provides for stakeholders such as trade unions representing individuals working in the chain of activities, and also civil rights organisations such as human rights defenders and environmental organisations that are active and experienced in the area of the complaint to be able to lodge complaints as well. So in terms of reporting then, companies who are also covered by the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive can meet their reporting obligations under the CSCD by complying with the CSRD's reporting requirements. And this avoids any duplication of reporting, which was a key concern during the course of the negotiations, that we would attempt to reduce the administrative burden where possible in relation to companies. In respect of climate change measures, then companies will be required to adopt a climate transition plan to ensure that their business model and strategy is compatible with the transition to a sustainable economy and with the limiting of global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is in line with the Paris Agreement. So essentially, the climate change measures that are provided for under the CSD are aligned with the CSRD's requirements, and that's basically to ensure that these directives complement each other on that aspect. If we then turn to enforcement and civil liability, well, firstly, member states will need to designate one or more national supervisory authorities to ensure compliance by the companies with their obligations. Those national supervisory authorities will need to have adequate powers and resources to carry out the relevant tasks, such as like the power to request information and carry out investigations. And in turn, the national supervisory authority, where they do find that there has been a breach of those obligations, they can impose financial sanctions up to a maximum of 5% of the turnover of the company concerned. So in relation to civil liability, companies can be held liable for situations where the company, its subsidiaries, or its direct business partners failed in their due diligence obligations. And importantly, it's provided that their conduct was intentional or negligent, and it gives rise, and that essentially gave rise to an adverse impact occurring which caused damage. So there was other measures provided for in relation to civil liability as well. There's the provision for injunctive procedures. There's also a limitation period of 5 years in relation to taking an action. And then civil society organisations and trade unions have also been given the legal standing to take proceedings on behalf of the victims. So in terms then of business support measures, the European Commission will be obliged to establish a single help desk through which companies can seek information, guidance and support in how to comply with the directive. The Commission will also have to prepare guidelines for companies on a variety of topics, including how to conduct due diligence, sector-specific guidance, and how companies can share resources and information in order to comply with the directive. And these guidelines will be made available by the Commission between 30 and 36 months after the directive comes into force. So then I guess in terms of next steps, you'll see from the screen there that once the directive has been finalised and published in the official journal of the EU, member states will have 2 years to transpose the directive. There's going to be a phased approach to the application of the directive. So at 3 years post-publication, it will apply to companies that have 5,000 employees and 1.5 billion of turnover. At 4 years, it's 3,000 employees and 900 million, and at 5 years, then it's 1,000 employees and 450 million. So I suppose in terms of the next steps for the department, we're currently mapping out measures that we need to take in relation to transposition. So we will kind of continue to keep stakeholders informed in relation to that. And that's essentially the end of my presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions that anybody may have, and I might just hand over then to my colleague, Alan.
Okay, many thanks, Ashley. And just let me set up my slides here. Okay, so people can see that. So, yeah, my name is Alan Power. It's very good to speak before you today. And I'm going to be talking to you about the EU's proposal for a regulation on prohibiting products made with forced labour on the union market. So just in terms of background, this regulation was originally proposed in September of 2022 when it was published by the European Commission. And since that time, the proposal has been co-led by two DGs within the Commission, DG Grow and DG Trade. Now, forced labour, including forced child labour, continues to be a major global issue, with the International Labour Organization estimating that the global number of people in a situation of forced labour is standing, according to the latest estimates, to around 27.6 million. And that's according to the Economics of Forced Labour, which the ILO published in recent months. And approximately 93% of these suspected cases of forced labour occur outside the EU. Now, when we talk about kind of forced labour, this includes the likes of coercion, systematic withholding of wages, threats of physical and sexual abuse, and also the paying down of recruitment fees by migrant workers. So what this proposal for draft regulation is kind of setting out to do is to effectively prohibit the placing and making available on the EU market and the export from the EU of products made with forced labour. In that respect, it's a product ban and is seeking to undermine the practice of forced labour through kind of undermining the low risk and high profit model as described by the ILO. It has a broad scope with all companies and all products that are imported or made within the EU, as well as exports, including the components regardless of industry or geographical location. And it's not going to target specific countries, companies, or industries, but rather it'll seek to effectively ban the selling of forced labour goods in the EU, irrespective of the source. So where do we currently stand with the proposal? It's not quite finalised, but the finish line is in sight. So since it was originally proposed in September 2022, there have been 16 working party meetings composed of Commission services and member state experts, which produced 4 compromise texts. And at the second trilogue on 4th of March of this year, the European Council, Commission and European Parliament reached a provisional deal on the text of the regulation. Now, this agreement has subsequently been referred on and approved by the Committees on International Trade, Internal Market and Consumer Protection within the European Parliament, as well as on 23rd of April by the plenary session of the European Parliament, in which there was 555 kind of votes in favour. Now, the final regulation is expected to be brought before the new European Parliament in September for final approval, after which it will be published in the official journal and enter into force. And at that point, Member States and the Commission will then have 3 years to implement the regulation in its entirety. And the first deadline within that 3-year period to be met will be after 12 months, in which Member States will have to designate the National Competent Authority, which will lead on the enforcement and implementation of the regulation within Member States. In terms of the main features of the regulation, so it relies on the forced labour definition as set out in Article 2 of the Convention on Forced Labour from 1930 of the International Labour Organization. And through its reference to international standards, it's therefore aligned with the EU's broader efforts in the area of forced labour and modern slavery. Now, the approach that's set out in the regulation is two-pronged. So to ensure an effective allocation of investigations between member states, member state competent authorities, i.e. the bodies tasked with implementation and enforcement, and the Commission, Article 15 of the text outlines an allocation mechanism based on the location of the suspected forced labour. So where the suspected forced labour takes place outside of the territory of the EU, i.e. Approximately 93% of cases, the Commission will lead investigations and field inspections. And where the suspected case is taking place within the territory of the member state, the national competent authority of that member state will lead in the investigation. And at member state level, enforcement of the regulation will rest in cooperation between labour inspectorates, market surveillance bodies, and customs authorities. So the text of the regulation mandates that a risk-based approach will be adopted towards investigations. They'll therefore be focused on economic operators and where relevant product suppliers, which are involved in steps of the supply chain as close as possible to where the forced labor likely occurs, and which therefore has the highest leverage to prevent, mitigate, and bring the practice to an end. So lead competent authorities will take into account the size and economic resources of economic operators, in particular whether an economic operator is an SME, as well as the complexity of the supply chain. And following a decision by a national competent authority that forced labor has taken place in the making of a product, the economic operators which have been subject to investigation will be required to withdraw the products from the market or remove content for online interfaces, as well, or to dispose or replace the products concerned. Now, where economic operators comply, the decision will ultimately be withdrawn, and the their details will be removed from a forced labor single portal, which will be established on a cross-EU basis. But where there's continued non-compliance by economic operators, penalties will be imposed, reflecting the gravity and duration of infringement, previous infringements, and the degree of cooperation with national competent authorities by the operators. And that's going to be another deadline to be faced within a 3-year period, within 24 months of the regulation coming into effect. Member states will have to notify the level of penalties to the European Commission. Also, to ensure a uniform application of a decision taken by one member state throughout the union market, the principle of mutual recognition will apply. So a decision taken by a competent authority in one member state will be recognised by all other member states through a union-wide product ban. And to assist national competent authorities in enforcing the regulation and for raising awareness or providing guidance to businesses, a database will also be established and managed by the Commission. And this will contain independent and verifiable information from international, institutional, research or academic organisations, in particular the ILO and the UN. Now, the text of the regulation as it stands places big emphasis on supporting businesses in being compliant with the principles of the regulation. So according to the text, the European Commission will be mandated to develop measures to support economic operators and business partners in the same supply chain. For example, the Commission, in consultation with the relevant stakeholders, will make available and regularly update guidelines for economic operators on due diligence in relation to forced labour. It'll also make available for information for economic operators on best practices for bringing forced labour to an end, and also for remediating different types of forced labour. And this guidance will be focused in particular on assisting SMEs in complying with the regulation. At member state level, national competent authorities will also be required to designate contact points to provide information to SMEs for matters related to application of the regulation. And assistance may also be provided businesses by these authorities. And national competent authorities will also be able to organise training for operators on risk indicators and how to engage in dialogue with competent authorities throughout investigation. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the regulation on forced labour. As I said before, these are essentially kind of the guiding principles. The real detail and practicalities around implementing it will be kind of the subject discussions throughout the 3-year period, the lead-in time for the full implementation of the regulation, which we expect to come fully into force in around about September or October of 2027. So on that note, I shall end my slideshow and I'll hand back to our host, Owen Richardson. Many thanks.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks everyone for the excellent presentations, Aisling and Paul as well. So I suppose you can see there that there is a number of regulations and directives coming our way, and there's then the kind of originating principles through the OECD and how the kind of formulation and history of this area has worked. I know, and this has come up at numerous events I've attended and at our forum as well, is how do businesses navigate this, and how are they going to get the information? How are these going to work with each other? And it's a very good question, and it's a question we're asking too. So as Minister Calleary mentioned, we were successful with an application through DG Reform to get a project together which is going to be called the Responsible Business Compass. And we're working with the OECD on how best to get this kind of language harmonised across the regulations and directives where possible, to get the understanding put into plain English, both for policymakers and for businesses and stakeholders. And then finally, we'll be looking, this is roughly an 18-month project, we'll be very much looking at getting something public facing on that, which is a separate part of the project. And we're hoping that we'll have that on our National Enterprise Hub, which will be sitting on the Enterprise Ireland website. That's a bit away. As you mentioned, we're looking to get this done kind of as these regulations and directives come into play and are become law. So we expect by kind of the end of next year to have something to begin with, and then to increase and promote it, to make it easy for businesses to find out what are the ones relevant to them and what are the requirements of them, and then also where possibly and potentially there will be some level of support for them, but certainly where they can get the information and where the state is there to be a point of contact and to engage with you. So I just wanted to put that in context, and it was well referenced by the Minister. So I think we're into the Q&A session now, and we've had a few questions in. I'm going to go and start with a question each. We have enough for each of our panelists so far. I'd also encourage anyone to please add in a question to your chat. If we can't get them here, you see the contact email addresses on the screen, and we'd very much like you there to contact. Just as a final bit of housekeeping, this session is recorded and we put up onto our website on our Responsible Business page, and we'll try to, I know there was some issues, people saying they couldn't see the slides, so we can get the slides maybe linked there as well if that's useful for the participants here. So I'm going to just go through the questions that I've seen come up, and I'm going to go through. So I'll go to Paul first. A good question here for you, Paul. So as you mentioned that the guidelines are not mandatory, but how do the guidelines fit into the responsible business landscape when there are all these mandatory initiatives? So maybe you can answer that one.
Yeah, no, thanks a million, and thanks for that really interesting question. I suppose, yeah, the guidelines themselves are non-binding, but what they do is they have most certainly laid the foundation for these mandatory initiatives that we've seen coming down the tracks or coming into play. And I think in most instances, the guidelines are referred to at some point in some of these initiatives. What we're seeing now is having this smart mix of measures where we have voluntary initiatives such as the guidelines, the UNGPs, and for the guidelines specifically in the NCP process, it provides an alternative pathway to possibly resolving issues, which I think will continue to be a very important role and path for any entity to consider, that, rather than going down a particular route, that sometimes that NCP path actually might be useful for them. And as well, just to say as well, that sometimes the guidelines may go beyond what's set out in, some laws or whatever. So it's important to kind of think of those things as well. Thanks, Owen.
Great. Sorry, just looking at the next questions there. So next one, Aisling, up to you. And the question is, how, so there's a lot of, as you mentioned, crossover between the CSDD and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. How do they differ, the obligations for businesses in that, or can you answer that? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Owen. So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, I suppose, well, it was first in time, but that's essentially putting sustainability reporting on the same standards, or sorry, on the same footing as financial reporting. So in essence, that's a reporting directive, whereas the CSDD is placing legal obligations on businesses in relation to their operations. So it's a behavioral directive. The reality is, in general, they're tackling the same cohort of companies. Most companies that are covered by the CSRD scope will already be, like this, in terms of the CSCD scope, companies there will already be included in the CSRD scope. There'd be a small portion of companies, if they're non-EU companies essentially, who don't have a branch or subsidiary within the EU, who will fall within the CSCD, but they won't fall within the CSRD scope. So they will have to comply with reporting requirements, but those reporting requirements are going to be set out in a separate implementing act, which is to be published by the European Commission prior to that kind of coming into effect. I did, just to say, Owen, I see there's a few questions in relation to the CSRD in the chat in relation to the transposition. And I certainly wouldn't want to talk for my colleagues, but I do know, because obviously we work in the same division, that work on transposition is ongoing. And I think maybe if people have more specific questions, the CSRD has its own kind of info address, which I think is csrd@enterprise.gov.ie. So if people maybe have some specific questions, I know they have a very active stakeholder list, and they do email out to them updates in relation to transposition. So I would suggest maybe for anybody who's queries in relation to that, maybe just to contact them there. I do see also that there was a query in relation to how many companies will be covered by the CSDD. So we're kind of working with a ballpark figure of around 100 companies, but I couldn't get into more specifics in terms of the numbers of companies in relation to the actual phased approach in relation to that just at this juncture. Thanks a million.
Thank you, Archie. Yeah, no, a lot of questions coming in there on that, and yeah, no, that's some good answers. As we've had, just for information, we've had the colleagues on the CSRD previously, and we will get them in again for another in the series of it. So we try to mix it up, that it's not always the same, but we understand that as these move and progress and are nearing another important stage, we'll certainly look to bring them in. So no, that's a good point, and thank you for answering the questions and numbers. I'm going to ask Alan now a question, and this might be a tricky one, Alan. I don't know. If you were an end user with a product made in forced labour, or what will happen to it?
Many thanks, Owen. I'm actually joined on this call by my colleague John Morris. John, do you want to come in and address this?
Yes, I will. Thanks, Alan, and good afternoon, everybody. And it is a good question, Alan. This regulation, however, will not be applied retrospectively. It will only take effect on any goods going forward. There are a number of industries and areas where forced labour is more prevalent than others. Would be the garment industry, there would be the solar panels, the manufacture of them. There's a lot of forced labour that goes on in those industries. But if you're wearing a t-shirt or you have solar panels on your house, and the suppliers and the manufacturers were subsequently found to be in breach of the forced labour directives, the panels would remain on the house. The t-shirt will remain on your back, but going forward they would be subject to the ban.
Okay, that's clear, and it's a very good consumer point in this, and
yeah,
as it is a product ban.
It is. It's important to always keep that in mind, that this regulation just is focused specifically on the product, and it's about tackling forced labour through the banning of products. There are 8% of the worldwide total forced labour victims within the EU, but they would not all be covered or protected with this ban, because it's just about manufacturing and the banning of the products that are manufactured. If they're in the service industries or within other industries that don't produce an end product, that they wouldn't be subject to this. It'd be exclusively a product ban.
Yeah, that's very good. And you might see, John, there's another question coming in. I don't know where yourself are going to answer this, but if a good is found to be made with forced labour and it's on the market, so we're not talking about an end user there, it has has it been decided what will happen to that product afterwards, or is that still in the
Well, it will depend on, ideally, if the product can be donated. If the investigation is completed and if the forced labour has been found to have taken place, if the product is fit for donation to a charitable cause, it will cease to be the property of the economic operator at that point, and will become the property of the competent authority. If they can donate it, that will be the ideal situation. Otherwise, the second option then would be if it can be recycled in any way as part of the circular economy. And the last option would be if neither of those can be availed of, the product would be destroyed. But if it is, all of these will have to be taken, environmental impacts will have to be taken into account if there is a destruction of any products.
Okay, that's very good. I mean, it's a destruction as a last resort.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. If it can be repurposed or recycled or donated, it only makes sense to do that.
Excellent. So I think for our audience there, we have another number of good answers there to questions that have come in. So I think we will cease the Q&A there. So thank you to all the panelists on that, to Paul, to Alan, to John, and to Aisling. And it's been very informative. As you can see, we're really trying to create a forum here for outreach, to get those salient questions coming in and to try and answer them. Some of them we may not be able to answer, and we will certainly take them on board, and they form part of our discussions as we go forward on these. We have, as we said, the Responsible Business Forum, which is chaired by Minister Calleary, and really is getting into the meat of several of these where there are issues of contention or where there's issues of understanding. As I said, part of the immediate request was to come out with some level of communications, which is really the focus of myself and my team's workload in this area to really communicate with you. But we rely on the expertise of our colleagues around the department and potentially beyond the department. So I'd just like to thank them so much for the effort to come here, to present and to answer the questions. And just on a final note, as we wrap up, to say to all our attendees, thank you so much for coming. That this area of sustainability, of moving into human rights and everywhere is a requirement of our society. It's where we're moving to. And we want to assist those businesses to take advantage where they can, where they have to comply. We want to assist them and help them. To be compliant is better for policyholders and government than to work against people who are non-compliant. And we want to assist you on that. We want to focus with our small businesses, how to work with your larger businesses. And as the old motto has gone in everything from environmental to Brexit and everything, know your supply chain. And as much as we can, we'd like to help you do that. So without further ado, I'd just like to wrap up and say thank you to everyone and thank you for attending and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.